and thank you for your donation. I'm so glad I could help today.
I'm Alexander Graham Bell. My friends call me Alex. And I'm Thomas Alva Edison. All my friends call me Boss. I invented the telephone. And I actually made it work. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. Look, no one else came up with the idea of converting sound into electrical currents and then back into sound. You just got that because you were at the patent office first. Are you accusing me of stealing ideas? Well, no. Well, good, because that's mostly what you do with your workers. Whoa, 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 be nice. It was my idea to make your transmitter work with a new carbon diaphragm. You and your fascination with carbon. Carbon this, carbon that. My brain's made of carbon. Oh, look, Mr. Sheep Butcherer. Look, light bulb boy. Hello? Hello? That's right. It's time to talk about old-timey electronic communications here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. I'm Glenn Kyle, and we haven't really touched on this before, but it's incredibly important to think about is the way that we have begun to communicate electronically, and how did that start? How did we get to where we're at today? And of course, it is a vast and complicated story full of innovation, full of exciting narratives, full of incredibly dull but incredibly important technological advances. We're not going to get into all those details today. We're just sort of going to place everything into a broader historical context. And to do that, we have to set up the world as it was before electronic communications. And this is something that we have talked about here because we want people to understand what it was like back in a 3-mile-per-hour world. Remember, the way that we expressed ideas to one another, the way that we exchanged news was through the written word. And that means we wrote things on paper, and that paper had to be delivered. Now, even when we printed things on paper and could make it go a little faster, like newspapers and things like that, those things traveled between points as fast as a person could walk or a horse could walk. Not a horse could run because, of course, a horse can't run 24 hours a day. They have to rest, they have to eat, they even have to sleep. So the rate at which the post is going to move is very dependent upon how many stops you have along the way, the health of the horses, the weather, the quality of the roads, and things like that. That's why I say it's a 3-mile-an-hour world. So if I want to call my family member or not call, see, it's already entered the idioms. When I want to communicate with my family or my friends, I have to write a letter and get that to them. And that letter, depending upon how far away they are, could take days, could take weeks, could take months, even on the North American continent, much less trying to go overseas. So people, of course, always wanted to find some way where they could communicate more rapidly and perhaps even instantaneously. And that's something that the technology of the later 19th century really began to wrestle with and to find ways to do it. And we did. And we used electricity and electronic signals over wires to do that. Now, of course, we're going to start very simply with electric wire, of course, usually copper wire. You can send an electrical impulse over that. That's fairly easy to do. They had to find a way to amplify that to make it travel over long distances, and they had to find a way to make that meaningful. Now I'm going to do a little genie move here and kind of show you how they used to string the wire, and then we'll go into how they used to do it. Bink! Okay, so we have here a very small replica of what the lines would have looked like. Imagine these as the large poles, and they have on top glass insulators, right? They're glass because glass does not conduct electricity, and strung along these glass insulators and the poles up in the ground is copper wire. And it's going to be varying gauges, it's going to be varying strengths, because that's what the signal is going to move along. And at first, this stuff wasn't even insulated, right? It was just bare copper wire. And if there's any break along a point, that means that communication ceases. So very often, when they strung the wire from one place to the other, they're going to do 2 different lines so that if something does happen to one, or it breaks, or a bird lands on it, or something like that, hopefully the signal is still going to be able to continue. But this is the basic method of how things are going to run when it's wired technology all the way up into modern phone lines and really electricity lines, but we're not talking about electricity, we're talking about communications. So this is what you're going to see all along from the late 1800s all the way up until very, very recently. The telephone lines or the communication lines are going to be of this. So you can see, glass insulation running as far as it could. And to repair it, you would have to ride the line and find where the break was. So much for wires. Okay, so now we have the means of which to send an electric current over long distances. And as you can imagine, this is a rather significant undertaking. There are companies that have to invest a lot of money in the labor, in the poles, in the copper wire, and maintaining them to do that. So they're going to have to, of course, charge a fee to use the service. And the first way they do this is with a Morse key, using Morse code. I know most of you are probably at least familiar with this a little bit. It's the right? That's what Morse code is. Samuel Morse invented this system and came up with a type of code to send messages. And what he did, he used that little series of dots and dashes and applied it to letters of the alphabet so that you could sit on one end, and this is called a key, a Morse key, and you would tap that, right? And that's how you would send the message out. And it would be hooked up to a battery, would come into it, and then the signal would go from this Morse key down those wires that I just showed you over a certain distance, and on the end would be this receiver. Now, you may not be able to hear this one really good, but you can see there are two coils here, two electric coils, so the wire would be coming into this, and it would go through those two coils, and every time the electric pulse went through the coils, it would cause this little metal bar to move ever so slightly, right? It's very, very slight, but a trained telegrapher is going to be able to listen to those sounds, right, and determine what the message is. And this becomes very, very common. They have this actually in the American Civil War. There are a lot of technological advances that the North tends to have over the Confederacy, and significant and complex communication system, electronic communication system is one of those. Grant is able to communicate with Washington, D.C. back and forth during the Western campaigns, and he uses it when he comes to Washington, D.C. to send orders and get reports from the other generals around the country. So it becomes very, very important, and it's the same process going up into the Old West and things like that, right? Is that dot, and it's clicks and things. And when radio communication is developed, it really uses Morse code to do the same thing. Even though it's not traveling over wires, it's traveling over the airwaves. Morse code does the same thing. And that's great. But the problem is, you either have to know Morse code or you have to go to the people who run the Morse business and have them send your messages back and forth, those telegrams, right? Wouldn't it just be way easier if we could actually talk to one another the same way that we're doing now? Or you might do it with a friend sitting at home in your living room. Just talk. And that sort of became what people were looking for the next leap. And we finally get a fellow named Alexander Graham Bell. And I won't go into the whole history of how he developed his telephone, but it is interesting. You can look that up for yourself. But the idea is he basically invented a good microphone and a good speaker that could transmit it over a longer distance. The beauty is you can still use the same conductive wire. You can still use copper wire, or maybe steel wire, but usually copper wire to use that. And you could use your voice and transmit your voice to some other place, and someone could hear it. And someone could listen to you and talk back to you, and it would transmit your voice. This was revolutionary. Again, think of the days where we had to wait for horses and mules to bring letters for weeks and weeks, and suddenly, if the infrastructure is in place, we can simply pick up a phone and talk to each other and hear voice and have a conversation. A conversation would have taken months in the days before the telephone. Just so you understand how revolutionary this is, for the exchange of ideas and information and contact. Now, at first you had to have someone, when you picked up an old telephone like this one, you can see there's no keypad, there's no dial on it or anything. You just pick it up, and when you pick it up, you raise this arm, which opens a line, and this is the part you talk into, and this is the part you listen to. And you would pick it up, it would open a line, and someone on the other end would say, "Hello, operator," and you would say, "Hello, I need to contact such and such, or BR549, and you would give them a city or a place with a number, with an associated number. You had to know the number. And the operator on the other line, and you can see a lot of these operators in the photograph behind me, would have to manually look at their board and take the wires and connect them like this, right? That's what that is behind me. Is it's a huge, large, interconnected circuit board. And back behind that, if you think that looks complicated, the back is nothing but wires, but those connections had to be made manually. And this job, in England, it was given to young boys, but here in the United States, it was a job that was almost exclusively given to women. Women were actually pretty good at this. It was considered secretarial, but the ability to handle all these complex transformations of numbers and letters and make the connections, that's something that women generally tend to do better than men. And so women made excellent telephone operators, and it sort of became a job that women could do in the era when women did not have the opportunity to do a lot of jobs in the real business world. Many of them could become telephone operators, and many of them did. Now, as this system grew, it became more and more complicated, and it could take longer and longer, actually, to make the connection. Because remember, you have lots of different lines from lots of different companies running in between towns, in between cities, sometimes in the same city if it's big enough, and they need to somehow interconnect. And so the operators could get very, very busy, and the more people that got a telephone and paid for the service, by the way, remember this is still a business, the more people had to create a complex system where all these different single points could communicate with somewhere else. And it's about at this time that they began to lay the first transatlantic telephone cable. They had already laid a transatlantic Morse Code telegraph label. They had already laid a transatlantic telegraph cable so that they could send Morse back and forth from Europe to America. Again, imagine the mind-blowing simplicity of being able to send a message from New York to Paris and get a reply in the same day. So weird. But now we're getting to the point where we can actually have telephone conversations. And the real technology is being able to push a strong enough signal so that it can get through to the other side very, very clearly. So there are lots of repeater stations and lots of things that are developed to make the signal continue on and be very, very strong. Now, of course, what they want to do is continue to make this easier and easier, because they have this where you can just pick up and ask to talk to Sarah and she can connect you, but it's still a step in the process. There's still a labor pool that has to work. And this system goes from the earliest days of the telephone, really, in some places, until the 1940s or even 50s. But at that point, they have developed a system that is more or less automatic. Now, there are still operators there if there's a problem, but it's called, in England, it was a rotary system. In America, it was a panel system, but basically, it was this, right? The handset has become something that has both the speaker and the microphone in one thing, so that you can hold it up to your head like this. And then down here, there is a dial. And there's a dial with 10 numbers, 1 through 0. And then, of course, each telephone, each location is given a telephone number. And you will simply, a lot of you folks my age and older know what this is, but some of you younger ones might not understand it. And you have to put the number in this way. And what it does is, inside the phone, as you turn that dial, it sets that certain number. It sends a signal to a local telephone exchange. And this local telephone exchange has it's not a computer. It is a computer, but it's not a digital computer. Everything's manual, right? It's mechanical technology, and it's a series of magnets and relays that make these connections with the signals they're getting from your telephone. So from your telephone, when you dial the number, you're able to get that connection. Now, this was a very, very big change for a lot of people. Like I said, this method had been going on for decades, and now there's a new system that people have to learn. Well, the telephone companies knew that they were going to have to help people understand the new systems. If it's going to be self-driven, there are going to have to be cues that people using a telephone have to follow. So what we've got for you now is a short video by Westinghouse made in 1954 that's a great tutorial on how you can use your new rotary phone.
Hello, everyone. I'm from your telephone company, and the message that we have for you is that we are changing your telephone service over to dial. There's been a lot of planning, preparation, and work in order to bring dial to town. You may have noticed that lots of work has been going on. New cable pulled into place and other types of construction. If the dial isn't already on your telephone, it soon will be. Many months ago, our engineers started to draw up the plans because equipment must be tailor-made to fit the needs of each community, not only for today's requirements, but for years to come. To design, build, and install this equipment takes time and money. This is an investment in the future of your community. It won't be long now until dial telephones are ready to serve you. So that there will be no interruption in your telephone service during the changeover, everything is made ready. When the signal is given, the fuses are pulled out of the lines that were part of your manual equipment. At the same instant, we close the connections in the dial equipment, and dial service is born. Instead of hearing the operator's familiar "number please," you'll hear the dial tone. That means that the equipment is ready to handle your calls. Dial service, however, doesn't do away with the need for operators. You'll always find operators ready to help whenever you need them, for an emergency, information, for out-of-town calls, or for any call in which you experience difficulty. You will find that dial telephones are very easy to use. And I'd like to give you some pointers so that you can make the best use of your dial telephone. Now, let's examine the dial itself for just a moment. For convenience in dialing, the letters go around the dial in alphabetical order, and the numbers are in numerical order, from 1 to 9 and 0. And in the center of the dial appears the number of the telephone you are using. With dial service, telephone numbers consist of a central office name and 5 numbers, like this: Main 2 9970. We use central office names and the additional numbers so that as many telephone numbers as possible will be available for each community. Also, this numbering system makes it possible to fit you and your neighbors' telephones into a uniform nationwide plan. This enables operators and telephone users to dial long-distance calls to distant cities. Now, there are a few easy rules to be followed when dialing, because careless dialing mistakes will waste a lot of your time and cause someone else to be inconvenienced and probably irritated. When you want to make a call, always be sure you have the right number. Consult your directory for any number you're not sure of. Write the number down, like this. It will save you a lot of time and trouble if you keep the numbers in front of you while dialing. Now, let's use this demonstration model for a moment while we dial our number. Take up your receiver and always listen for the dial tone. Remember how it sounds, a steady hum. Now, let's dial the number we looked up and made a note of. Remember, always be sure to dial the first 2 letters of the central office name, then the 5 numbers. For example, for word 4, 9970, dial W O 4 9 9 7 0. When dialing, notice that I brought my finger around until it firmly touched the finger stop. And now I remove my finger and let the dial go back by itself. Failure to bring your finger firmly to the finger stop with each pull of the dial may cause you to reach a wrong number. The same can happen if you force the dial back instead of letting it go back by itself. For incorrect dialing causes inconvenience and delay, not only to you, but to anyone you may have dialed in error. Another important point to remember when dialing is that wherever you have the letter O or the numeral O, as in our example number worth 4, 9970, you will find the letter O next to N on the left side of the dial. The numeral O is always in the same space with the word operator. Now, soon after you dial the number you want, you will hear this tone. That's the ringing signal, an interrupted burring sound. Now, it tells you that the telephone at the number you dialed is ringing. The ring will continue until the telephone is answered, or if there is no answer, until you hang up. So let the telephone ring for at least a minute, or about 10 rings, to give the person you're calling time to answer. Now, if the number dialed is busy, you will hear a signal like this. The busy signal, a buzz-buzz sound. When you hear this signal, hang up. Try again a little later. Now, those of you with a party line may lift your telephone to listen for the dial tone and hear conversation or ringing signal. This means that another party on your line is using the telephone. When this occurs, hang up. And wait a reasonable length of time before you try again. Now, to make certain that you are completely familiar with the use of the dial, let's review the few easy rules. Make sure that you have the right number. If not, consult your directory. Write the number down. Make a note of the numbers you frequently call. You can get a free personal numbers booklet for this purpose from your telephone company business office. Now, before dialing, listen for dial tone. If you dial before you hear dial tone, you may get a wrong number or no number at all. Refer to the complete number while dialing. Then, dial the first 2 letters of the central office name. W O. And the 5 numerals which make up the complete number. 4 9 9 7 0. Making sure your finger firmly touches the finger stop with each pull of the dial. This will save you time and inconvenience. When you have completed dialing, listen for the ringing signal. Wait for the party to answer for about 1 minute or 10 rings. If you wish at any time to review dial procedure, you will find instructions in the front of your directory. If you will remember these easy rules, you will dial correctly and be pleased with the use and convenience of your dial telephone.
So, you see, that's something also that people my age and older, we remember those dial tones and those ringtones and, those busy tones that seemed to last forever and we couldn't get in touch with who we wanted to talk to. Remember, folks, this is before call waiting. This is before anything like that. But it was amazing because you could just pick up a phone and dial someone, right? And this starts to become the classic phone. Now, this phone is red. This is not the one that was used between Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cold War. But they came in a variety of colors now. They became stylish, and they could ring. And the rotary system still, I love that sound. It takes me back to my youth. When they used this, it opened up a whole new world. And people who grew up with this couldn't imagine the way things used to be. We only saw this kind of stuff. It was old-fashioned, right? The 1960s saw the Andrew Griffith Show, and of course in the small town of Mayberry, people still had to pick up the phone and ask for Sarah. But in most places, people were getting rotary phones, and that began to revolutionize how we were able to communicate, how business could be done, how information could be exchanged. This is the point where letter writing starts to go away, because we don't need to write letters so much anymore. Unless it's something very personal, we can just pick up the phone and call someone. Now, locally, it wasn't a charge except for your normal monthly phone bill. However, if you had to call long distance, that could get quite expensive because you had the companies, the local companies that began to use telephone systems and exchanges had to pay for other services and integrate with other companies and things like that. So calling long distance could become quite expensive. And we're talking dollars and dollars a minute. And so you had to limit it if you were going to call long distance. There were lots of different things you could do. You could call, collect. And for you young kids, I want you to notice there's no kind of screen or anything here, right? This is, you dial the number and you get it, which means that when your phone rings, you don't know who's calling. And so when you pick up, it could be your best friend, it could be your aunt that you don't want to talk to, it could be a lot of different people. So every time you pick up the phone, it's a surprise as to who it's going to be. You also got telephone books. These were printed books that the phone companies put out locally each year that would have everyone on the system's name and telephone number, and usually an address where they lived. And it was the directory, and it was a great way to look things up, and the businesses were put into the yellow pages. And of course, when your phone rang, it was an actual bell. Even going back to these, there's a small bell inside that would get that electric impulse that someone was trying to contact you, and it would ring. And of course, now we say our phone is ringing, or I'm going to call you, or I'm going to dial a number. We don't dial numbers. This is a dial, right? It's circular. We don't dial numbers anymore, and our phones don't have bells inside of them, but the lingo, the vocabulary has continued on. Now, after the rotary phone, what's the next big step? In the 70s and especially in the 1980s, things began to digitize because the technology continues to grow. They begin to use digital technology rather than mechanical technology to try to make these exchanges work, because the more people, the more expansion of the telephone industry, the more numbers you're going to have, the more phones inside of individual homes and businesses you're going to have. So you're going to have a lot of data going around, and digital seems to be the way. And so eventually companies began to go, instead of a rotary phone, they would have a touch-tone phone, right? So you heard in the 1954 video the sounds from the dial tone and the busy tone and things like that. In the push-button phone era, they kept those sounds mostly just as a sense of comfort. They did the same thing, But the way it worked was very different. Instead of the rotary phone having a mechanical series of connections that it has to make, when you push your push touch, when you hit your button phone, it just sends one digital beep signal, right? And those digits go into a digitized computer exchange and the signal goes out, much like you have here. So in offices, things began to get pretty complex. You could have different lines coming into one office to go to different desks and things like that. The digital revolution really changed the way that could be done. And we've got a little bit of a sound, so just so you know, we'll do a rotary sound and then, you hear that? Then we'll do a push button telephone sound that sounds much like the cell phones today, but it's a little different. So those are the sounds that you're going to hear differently. These, all that I've been talking about, of course, everything I've been talking about so far depends upon wires going from one place to the other, greatly depends upon things being connected in your house. All these have cords that come out of the back and have to plug into a place in your wall. They're cords. You're limited in mobility. You're limited by what we today call a landline because the wire goes over land. In the 1990s, something began to develop that, of course, was going to revolutionize things even further in terms of electronic communication: the cell phone. Now, in England, they call these mobiles because they're mobile phones. They're mobile. They can move around. But here in the United States, we tend to call them cell phones because the technology involved a cellular communication, a radio-based frequency communication that could go back and forth. And now we have here one of the first widely available commercial car phones, right? These were car phones because you're not going to carry around something like this on your person because it would take too much of a battery. But you can see it still has a lot of the same things. You've got the handset, right? You have the buttons on the back of the handset, but now you also have a digital screen so that you can see the numbers. You have this, which plugs into your phone's auxiliary power unit so that this thing can be powered. And then this big block here, this big heavy thing, this is the transmitter and the antenna, not the battery. It's this big, right? And you have to carry this thing around in this big bag. And so this was a bag phone or a car phone, right? And those were the first ones. And you had to have some kind of money to get something like that in the 1990s. And as time went by, of course, they began to make things smaller and smaller and smaller. And until finally, you could get something that would literally fit in the palm of your hand, could go in your pocket, and could be used to communicate with anyone within, who could also have a phone. Again, super revolutionary, evolutionary. That's a good argument and conversation we could have. But it made us able to talk to someone anywhere. And I've sort of skipped over the pager or the beeper, which was a little black box that you could dial their number and then send a message and then hang up. And usually it was just the number to call you back. And it was a little black box that goes beep, beep, beep. And they would look at it and it would give them the number they need to call. I think the only time this has lasted further than it should have is in hospitals. A lot of doctors still use pagers and beepers because they can't always pick up a phone, but they do want to get the number. But those pagers were a big thing, but it was only one way. It was basically saying, here's something that you need, here's a number you need to call, so when you get to a phone, call it, right? In the 1990s, cell phones were just coming into common accessibility, and in the early 2000s, you start to get a lot of flip phones, like I said, like the Nokias and things like that. And then getting, of course, to the end of this electronic communication journey, people want more and they want more. And Steve Jobs, with the iPhone, created the smartphone, which could not only use voice communication, but could use, if the system was in place, an internet-based network so that it could get actual things on the phone as well. You could do email, messaging, you could get text, and eventually you could access the internet. The internet was also very new, and the idea that you had this thing in your pocket that you could not only call someone with, but access information, I would say that is revolutionary, and we're still living with the results of that revolution today. We're in the very midst of it because it's changing the way our society works, right? We go from a time where it's all letters to a time when it's just bits and dots to a time when we could actually use voice communication over wires, and then we could use it over the air. And then suddenly here in 2020, I want you to think about this. In just a little over 100 years, we've went from voice communication and wire communication on a fairly primitive basis to this stuff, right? We have the sum of human knowledge in our back pocket and can talk to any place on the planet through space for about $50 a month. People, this is amazing. And it's amazing, and it's revolutionary, and it's a curse. Because I'm with you on this. We all spend usually too much time on these things because there's so much on them. And you could say it started with Morse code and got all this. Why go visit someone when you can just pick up a phone and call them? Why write someone a letter when you can send them an email or a text? The ability to communicate electronically has vastly changed our world and how we interact with each other as humans. And now it's gotten to the point where we almost don't have to interact at all. And we've all struggled here in 2020 with the coronavirus and things like that. And we've begun to experiment with ways we can work from home. We've begun to experiment with ways we can educate using a lot of new digital medias. And yet there's still something about that vital human interaction that we all miss and that we all crave. These are all good things. They've made our life better, but don't let it take over your ability and your opportunity to just spend some time with a family member or just spend some time with a friend, face to face with mask, just looking at each other, talking to each other. I remember my grandmother, it seems so silly to me when I was 10 years old. My grandmother would say, well, why don't you come and see me? And I would say, well, what are we going to do? And she'd say, I just want to sit and look at you. And I thought that was so weird at the time. Why would you want to just sit and look at me? But now as I get older and I'm inundated with information and electronic communications, sometimes I do just want to sit and look at somebody. You've sat and looked at me for a little bit, learning about all these great electronic communications devices. And with great power comes great responsibility. We're going to responsibly continue to use our digital media to get history to the masses, to folks like you, and as many audiences as we can. But we need your help. We're having this telethon. We're so glad you're tuning in. And there are 3 great ways you can help support programs like this. You can help support the History Center, meet our goal, and hit all those stretch goals. Number 1, you can click the link below that will take you to a website where you can make a donation that way. Number 2, you can actually call us 770-297-5900 during normal business hours, and you will actually get a real live person who can take your donation over the phone. Or if you want to use that 3-mile-an-hour world and be really old-fashioned, you can either drop by here at the History Center to give us a check or mail us one. 322 Academy Street, Northeast, Gainesville, Georgia, 30501. Folks, thanks for tuning in. We've got a lot of great things coming up. And until I can see you in person next time, stay safe, take care, and thanks for your support of the Northeast Georgia History Center.
History Center, please hold. History Center, please hold. History Center, please hold. Please hold. Please hold. Hey everybody, Leslie here, Archives Manager at the Northeast Georgia History Center. We have so many fascinating artifacts, photographs, and documents in our archives, like all of these super cool phones. Check out this one from the 1920s. It takes a lot of work and supplies to protect and organize these artifacts. Your donations help us with that work. Please consider donating today. Any amount helps, and there are some really cool thank you gifts for your donations. Give today online at the link below, over the phone at 770-297-5900, or you can mail a check to 322 Academy Street Northeast, Gainesville, Georgia 30501. Thanks, everyone. Now, back to these phone calls. History Center, please hold. History Center, please hold.